Hello and welcome to today's very special new series on social media with the OC Forum. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Congressman Lou Correa. You are a great friend of the Forum, and I'm so grateful that you could join us this morning.
Well, it's good to be back, Ms. Barrios. It's been a long time, but I really enjoy coming to Orange, the city of Orange. As you know, I grew up in Anaheim, live in Santa Ana. And a long time ago in high school, I dated a girl from Orange. So that kind of makes me a very Central Orange County kind of a guy.
Well, the Forum is very grateful to have you and honored. And the topic that we're discussing today, you have had a lot of experience on, and not just personal experience, but now you're directing some of the policy that's going to affect this. So I wanted to start out with, social media kind of big picture, the good and the bad in terms of how it's influencing the United States today.
Social media, it's here, the genie's out of the bottle. It's a great communication means for us, for the world, for society. Yet at the same time, it's changed the way we do business in a sense of message, information, misinformation. How do you control it? What's the damage to society? I sit on Judiciary Committee, which is a committee, one of the committees, primary committee of jurisdiction over this issue of the First Amendment. And President Trump started talking about changing the liability laws when it came to the big social media companies and communication, because this is an important issue. Think about it, Ms. Barrios. You have the First Amendment, freedom of speech. There's a reason why it's the First Amendment to our Constitution. We value freedom of speech. At the same time, social media amplifies your speech, and it's not always accurate. 20 years ago, LA Times, before they ran a story, the Orange County Register, they would check with 2 or 3 sources before they would run the story. Now, you get the rumor, whoever makes it first gets the most hits, and then if it's wrong or if it's inaccurate, we got a problem. So social media, important, but we're still trying to figure out, working on how to make this a good tool for society.
I'm glad that you brought up the First Amendment, because one of the things that's always kind of shocking to me in recent years is how fewer and fewer young people place a really high value on the First Amendment, and should, when they're asked or surveyed, should the First Amendment or free speech be curtailed, the percentage of people saying yes keeps going up and up, particularly among young people. Is that troublesome in any way?
I think it's characteristic of the fact that most young people now get their information through social media. Ask the young people. Another question would be, how many read the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal? How many look at stuff that writers actually take a long time to put together and then publish online or print? I think most information now is just out quickly. And that's why I said we will, as a legislature, as a nation, Democrats and Republicans, this is something we all agree on. We have to figure out how to make sure there's more accuracy in social media.
Absolutely. I want to move to the Capitol insurrection, because you were right in the middle of all that on 2 different fronts, which I find fascinating, and I'm so glad, first of all, that you're safe, because I think the world of you. So when we first saw pictures from inside the congressional chambers, they were from you. They were from you on the floor, literally on the floor, as people were banging on the door. So that showcased a power of social media to tell us a story when emergencies are happening. Can you talk about that? And then I want to ask you about the Dulles Airport incident, because that's everything.
January 6th.
Yeah.
January 3rd, I got sworn in. January 6th, early in the morning, I drove my family to the airport, Baltimore, dropped them off. I took a train back to D.C., a train that was full of Trump supporters, President Trump supporters, going to the mall, to the big rally. Most people were very nice. I didn't see anybody who wasn't very nice. They were all very nice, respectful. I got off the train, walked through the crowd. Everybody was there preparing for the event. Nothing,
right. High spirits.
nothing uneventful there. Everything was essentially normal. And I was there as a member of the legislature to watch the historic count, which is the certification of the election, which is counting the Electoral College ballots. I was there in 2016 when then President Trump was certified as the new president. I wanted to be there too for Biden because, you know, as a kid from the hood to be in Congress to watch this, it's beyond belief. It's such an honor. So I was there.
Right.
Problem this time was because of COVID, they put me up on the gallery. So I was up there looking down. And the bigger problem was when things started going wrong. You saw guards running in and saying, Mr. Vice President Pence, we need to move you out.
In the chambers.
In the chamber, because President Pence was presiding
right.
over the ballot count. He's the guy. And then Nancy was there. The Republican leadership was there. They grabbed them and ran them out. Then the guards looked up at us and said, don't worry about it. Everything's fine. And, you know, us, you know, upstairs in the gallery looked at each other and said, this doesn't look normal.
Right.
And then all the alarms started going off.
The actual, like you're hearing the alarms in the building.
Like,
okay.
you know, there's, you know, fire alarms. Then you could smell the gas, you know, the gas, the tear gas. And then you heard a lot of banging and the guards were going chaotic. You could tell that even the Capitol guards were not in an element that they were supposed to be in. They never
right.
experienced this. And I looked around and I saw a lot of my colleagues, elder individuals,
right.
older than me. And we're trying to huddle them, moving
right.
ahead while everything was going chaotic. They said, put on your gas mask. And I said, what gas mask?
right.
They said, look under your chair. Oh, there's a gas mask here.
Oh, interesting.
But I couldn't put it on because what I was looking for, and at that moment, I began to realize that it was probably going to be the last day of my life.
Really?
People around me were crying. People around me having panic attacks. This is not just Democrats. It was
right.
Republicans too. You saw it in some pictures. Everybody was running for their lives. And upstairs in the gallery, we were trapped. And we heard the banging on the doors, and you assumed that at any moment they were going to break through. So I personally just got on that little place in my world, in my life, in my mind, preparing myself to take out maybe one or two as they came in. I figured I can take out one, maybe two, then they'll take me out.
You mean physically fight?
Physically.
Physically
there's nothing,
ready to go.
There's no 2x4, there's nothing to fight, no book to throw, just, we had nothing. And 3 or 4 of us were looking at each other and saying, yeah, this is it. We're going to have to just hold the line, which we knew would not happen for too long. And you know, since I was in the gallery looking down, I figured the best I can do is grab a couple, throw them off, and then they'll throw me off. But this is what we're going to do.
This is all what's running through your head in this moment.
What's running through my mind. And seeing my colleagues that were again having panic attacks, I think all of us were in a bad place. I have a colleague of mine who I saw on the ground crying, texting. Later on, I talked to her and I said, what were you doing? She says, I was texting my husband and my family. I wanted them to know that I was there for the last moments. And she said, want to see my text? I said, yes, please. She showed me the text and it said, honey, I'm here. I want you to know, love you. And at the end of the text, she said, know that my last act will be to take this pen and stick it in somebody's neck.
Goodness gracious.
And I said,
that's what she'd written to her family.
yeah, and I said, what did you do before you came to Congress? She said, I was CIA.
Oh my goodness.
And so everybody, it was an emotional experience.
And I think the pictures that I've seen that you took, and I think that someone took of you, were the first pictures, at least for me, and I know a lot of people who work in our office, seeing kind of feeling viscerally what it felt like. There was a reaction in those photos, seeing what it was like in that moment.
I tell you, Ms. Barrios, that what I think the worst part of this is what it did to our nation, what it did to me, because after we actually broke loose and broke through some doors, and most of my colleagues went into a safe place.
Right.
And myself and a couple of others actually started wandering the halls with some guards looking for stragglers.
To make sure everyone had gotten to a safe place.
The hunted became the hunters. We were looking for people. And you see how this activity turns Americans against Americans. I think the guards hesitated. First of all, they were overwhelmed, but they hesitated because you're trained to think of terrorists.
Right.
Somebody looks different, somebody talks different. But when you have somebody
But this is your own people.
This is somebody who looks like you with an American flag, you blink at shooting.
Right.
You don't shoot. One woman that was shot, almost breaking into the chambers where all whatever legislators were there, the guard that shot her probably stopped the massacre, because if everybody would have broken through.
Right, in that moment.
In that moment, you have guards with M16s, not the M16s,
right,
but versions of M16s that would have fired on the crowd, and then some of the crowd may have been armed, they would have fired back, and you would have had tremendous loss of life.
In that moment where everyone's pumped up and everyone's got adrenaline
and that's
pumping.
The word, pumped up.
Right.
I mean,
everybody
we were pumped.
was, yeah.
Everybody was pumped and ready to go.
So now that type of emotion doesn't come across on social media, but you can see the look on people's face, you see the videos. Does it bother you? Does it concern you that there are deniers about what happened?
It does, because again, you talk about social media. What's there to deny? I was working out with a Republican colleague of mine yesterday in the Capitol gym. Mm-hmm. And we talked about this woman that got shot and the guard that shot her. And we all agreed this thing happened. We came this close from losing total control there.
Right.
This was an attack on U.S. Congress to stop the certification of an election. Look, a lot of people don't like the outcome. A lot of people didn't like the outcome in 2016.
Right.
Okay? Hillary Clinton got more popular votes than President-elect.
Right.
They got elected, okay? Does it mean we go off and we storm the Capitol? No. You follow the Constitution.
Absolutely.
General Milley, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You might have seen his book came out this last few days. I'll tell you, the guy's a hero. You know why he's a hero? Because he was in a critical moment, in a critical position, that he decided to follow the Constitution. And that's what he did. He made sure that the Constitution ruled the day.
So let's move to just past that day, because then another incident happened involving you that it really kind of underscores where social media is good and bad, the good, bad, and the ugly of social media. So following the insurrection on January 6th, you head to the Dulles Airport in D.C. Tell me a little bit about that day, because that went completely viral, and I think in a way that the people who posted the video didn't think it would. And yet, and here again, it's you in harm's way.
That wasn't a different day. That was the same day.
Was it the same day?
Well, January 6th. I'm saying continue. I didn't sleep that whole night.
Okay.
We finished January 6th, moved into January 7th.
Okay.
We finished counting the electoral college
Because it went on to like
ballots.
2 in the morning.
Yeah, 2 or 3 in the morning. You're pumped up. There's no way you're going to go to sleep. So stayed up 4 or 5. I get up trying to get an Uber, a taxi. The whole Capitol's locked down. Finally get to the airport. Almost missed my flight. And I'm about to get on the plane, and I get surrounded by what seemed 20 or 30 people. And they got in my face, and I don't know how the heck they made me out, but then we had this melee that they
Right.
they wanted to come after me, and they, you know.
And you were completely alone.
I was completely alone, completely surrounded, and this gentleman got in my face. You know, I was ready to. I thought we were gonna duke it out, and then I had a bunch of other people on my back, so I knew it was a bad situation. But I have to tell you, I felt safer than I did in the Capitol. Let me tell you why. Everybody had gone through security.
Right.
Nobody
Right.
probably had a gun. Nobody probably had a knife. So it was going to be a good old-fashioned
Just a brawl.
brawl.
Yeah.
In the Capitol, we knew that was going to be life and death. And the other thing is, that fight at the Capitol was interesting, almost fight, because that video you saw was not my work product. It was their work product. I was there alone. They had 20 or
This is at
30
the airport.
Yes,
Yes.
at the airport, they had 20 or 30 people taking a video. So I imagine they, you know, cut and pasted and figured out what to show.
Right.
And of course, it did go viral.
Did they use the minion?
But let me say to you again, I didn't think my life was in danger. I just knew somebody was going to get a good whipping.
Right.
Probably
Right.
me, but you know,
Right.
we were gonna, you know, have a good time, so to speak. But I've been trained for those situations because I've had those situations in my district since 2016,
Right.
2017. After President Trump got elected, I started having, and I got elected too, by the way. I would have town halls in my district, especially
Right.
about immigration. Know your rights. Come, this is what you got to do.
I have been to a few of those, yes.
And I would have the red hats, people that would drive from miles away to come to disrupt, to cause fights, to get in my face. So you're trained. Okay, here we go. One more time. Let's
Right.
do this again. Let's do it. And so, yeah, that airport incident was just another one of many that I've had in my district over the years.
So you bring up a good point. So red hats, for people who don't know what that means.
Trump supporters.
And then they're coming to film and to spread a narrative. And then in that, they're posting and they're building up, you know, just more support, or they're spreading a certain narrative. I saw a great article talking about social media, because the president now has just, for better or for worse, in the last couple of days, has called out Facebook because of the pandemic and the coverage there. And the article said, of Facebook, you cannot be a casual editor. You cannot be, you know, a part-time censor. You're all in or you're all out. You really have to kind of, I think you've said this many times, pick a lane. Where do we go from here from a policy perspective? What are you looking
This
at?
is the central question we've struggled with, and we will decide on in the next few weeks, next few
Really?
months.
That quickly?
Section 230, I believe Section 230, that provides immunity to the big, you know, social media platforms for letting stuff
Right.
be on their system.
Which is the concept of, we are just content, you know, we just...
So at what point do you say this
content
stuff is
bulletin
so
board.
outrageously wrong,
Right.
that you got to stop it? And see, this is where you have to be very careful,
Right.
as legislators, because again, First Amendment, what I may think is right maybe is not what you think is right. My vision may not be your vision. Where do you draw that line to say, you need to censor this?
Right.
And the word is censor. You need to stop it. And I think the United States Supreme Court is going to be involved. We as a legislature are going to be involved. And this is going to be an area that we have to work on very, very carefully.
Right.
You have Cuba right now, okay? Cuba, an uprising by the Cuban people in the last week.
Right.
First thing that the Cuban government did, shut down internet.
Right. Keep people from communicating,
Keep people from
collaborating.
communicating. I disagree with that, okay? I would not want our social media, our communications shut down in America. But at the same time, you've got to be careful with what's out there.
Right.
And that is a very hard line to draw. but it's a line we will have to draw here very soon.
Now, you also, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, you also sit on the cybersecurity
Yes, ma'am.
task force, or no, I'm sorry, committee. So, how does that play into it? Because I know you've seen a thing or two, sitting on that particular committee. Does that play into it as well in terms of where we're going and what we need to be careful of?
It's all part of the same issue.
Right.
I sit on Homeland Security Committee. I chair an oversight committee within Homeland. Cyber is front and center. I don't know if you notice, the Russians are attacking us. The Chinese now allegedly are attacking us. We're counterattacking them. And we'll reach the point in society where we've got to come up with hey, you can't be doing this. They can shut down our water systems. We can shut down their water systems. Can we shut down one of their nuclear power plants or make it go away? Can they do that to us? We're in a very dangerous situation as a world where, it's like the 70s where we had mutually assured destruction.
Right.
You got a nuke against us, we got a nuke against you. So where do you put it? And right now, cyber is important because, in my opinion, America still has the most powerful cyber tools in the world. But once you use them, you let the other guy know what it is that you have. And that's why this is part of the internet, the web, how you use it. And remember, 2 or 3 aspects. Nations that sponsor this stuff. Then you have rogue operators that are not nations, that are essentially the crooks that are stealing your credit cards every day, that are the crooks that are going into the bank systems and holding bank systems hostage, colonial pipeline that essentially shut down energy delivery to the East Coast. This stuff is serious, and it's all part of the same issue.
What I find interesting is that it's all still a narrative. It's somebody's point of view, and it's tends to be one-sided. You're in Washington when you're in session and you're working. So you're working, it's Dems and Republicans working together. You just listen to social media, if you just listen even to traditional media, it looks like everybody's against each other. Like it couldn't possibly be an environment that there's collaboration, but for
Time
you,
out.
yes,
Time out.
yes.
Because this is an issue Democrats and Republicans agree.
And that was my question. What is it?
Republicans,
what is it like?
blame social media for President Trump's loss, so they want to rein in social media. Progressive Democrats, a lot of Democrats also believe you got to rein in social media for a lot of other reasons. And a lot of us, all of us essentially say, we need to rewrite the rules of the road. And it's important we do it and we do it right. And remember, it's not only us. The Chinese are going to do the same thing. The Europeans are going to do the same thing. And as you know, China right now is going through their own social media challenges, and the Europeans as well.
Now, you personally have 26,000 followers, probably more at this point, on Twitter. So you have built up a good network and a good, community that's following you and following your actions. What would you say to others about building a responsible community within social media?
I would say the truth matters, okay? It's important, those numbers in social media are important, but what is most important is to do what's right. To do what's right for this country and for your constituents. I can amplify that by changing the narrative of my message, but I choose not to. What I want to do is give my constituents the facts,
right,
and answer the questions and work for them. It's not about Lou, it's about keeping my constituents informed. I spend a lot of time in my district. I'm old-fashioned. I still like to come and go out to events, shake hands, go to church, and talk to people. To me, that's a better way of communicating. I think in the 5 years, I'm going on 5 years in Congress, I might have stayed up there no more than 1 or 2 weekends. I love to come back and be with my constituents.
You are seen quite a bit in your district, which we are all very grateful for. So one final question, and this may be social media, this may not, but what do you see as America's greatest challenge in the next decade?
The world has changed. As an American, as America, we are used to being the world's superpower, the world's greatest economy. World War II, after World War II, we're probably controlled 80% of the world's gross domestic product. We were the power because we're the only country that had not been destroyed by World
Right.
War II, essentially. Fast forward to today. There's a new kid on the block. Second, maybe the largest economy in the world now, China. Okay? And the challenge we have is managing that relationship. The challenge we have is making sure that this relationship that, kind of beneficial for the last 50 years, continues to be one that's productive. I see both China and the U.S. beginning to engage in an arms race. Not only conventional, space, cyber,
Right.
technology, artificial intelligence, you begin to see the competition unfolding. One of the good things I'm happy about the new administration is we are engaging in a way that says it's not us versus you, but it's our allies ourselves, Europeans, the Japanese, the Australians, the Americans, saying, this is what constitutes fair trade. This is what constitutes, adequate behavior in the high seas. But it's going to take a while to reestablish ourselves, readjust to the new system.
Right.
The South China Sea, I see it as a potential for major conflict in the future. They're building new aircraft carriers, they're building submarines. We're doing the same.
Right.
With that being said, we can't forget of other emerging challenges in our own hemisphere. I believe Latin America, I believe south of the border is an area we need to put more attention to. Everybody talks about the border. Everybody
Right.
talks about the challenges. But everybody forgets that they're not new.
Right.
We've had these challenges
For
50,
some
60
time.
years. And the only time we look is when we see smoke. And the only time we actually say, okay, let's do something about it is when we see a fire.
Right.
Okay? We have corruption. We have arms from the U.S. and other places that are fomenting violence
That have been there for years.
and we
Right.
just ignore them. And we have democratic institutions that are not stable. We have economic recoveries that are essentially non-existent.
Right.
We have to take care of our own backyard. I've been into a lot of discussions about security, about economic growth. This is going to take not 1 year, not two. It's going to take a decade or two to figure out. But we start by acknowledging that this is part of our sphere of, interest.
Right.
We have to make sure that we create an environment for economic growth so that people are not starving, people don't fear for their lives. That's the way you begin to fix these issues. And I tell my colleagues, again, I had this discussion with a couple of my Republican colleagues this week. I said, look, what we got to do, I said, is not just go to Central America next week and meet with the president, shake hands and say, okay, what do you need? No. We have to do is go every quarter. Visit often, talk to them and say, we're watching what you're doing. We will not stand for corruption. We will not stand for bad behavior. And the way we will enforce it is with the American rule of law. Let me explain to you.
Okay.
I'm trying to work on this
I know.
one.
Okay.
We've got a lot of these international organizations to oversee corruption, to oversee these things. I think the best way to let people know we're serious about corruption is to give the Department of Justice, the US DOJ, a long arm of the law. So if anybody breaks the law in other parts of the world that deals with, for example, foreign aid, if you take a US dollar of aid
Right.
and that ends up in your Swiss bank account,
Right.
we
Right.
can haul you into US court and put you in a US jail. I think that's what people fear the most around the world, is being in a United States jail for 10, 20 years. Keep it simple.
Yeah. And those are the kinds of policies you're looking at.
That's what I'm trying to address, look at, and work to implement right now.
Well, Congressman, as always, a great pleasure and just a super exciting honor to have you with us. And so much. We covered a lot of ground. So thank you for being with us today.
And that's just 1 week of congressional activity.
That's just 1 week, right?
Thank
1 week
you
is a
very
day of the
much.
life of Lou Correa. So
I love it.
Thank you
very
for
much.
spending a couple of minutes with us then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us. Please stick around. We're going to be right back after this quick break and talk to our next guest.
In honor of our 30th anniversary celebration of the OC Forum, we are raising $30,000 to establish an endowment fund. Our 30 for 30 fundraising campaign is looking for 30 generous sponsors to donate or pledge $1,000 to this fund. If you wish to contribute, please visit the link in the description below this video. I would also like to thank you for your continued support. These programs would simply not be possible without your contribution. Now please enjoy the rest of the show.
Well, welcome back, everybody. And if you're still with us, we just finished having a very powerful conversation with Congressman Lou Correa. And I'd like to introduce our next guest, who is a UCI law professor, Professor David Kaye. And welcome to our program today.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your area of focus and specialty and how it's the perfect fit for this conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I study the freedom of expression both in the United States and globally. And over the last several years, I've become increasingly interested in the way in which we think about freedom of speech in an online environment, right? In an environment where it is so clear that social media, search engines, other forms of online platforms play a significant role in mediating our democracy. And so, in fact, a colleague of mine, Rick Hazen, and I just this week launched a new center on fair elections and freedom of speech because this is such an important area for us to be thinking about.
Well, and that's a perfect segue into my first question for you, because as the congressman was relaying in very personal terms, very emotional terms, what it was like to be on the floor of Congress and have the insurrection take place around him. At the same time, for many of us, the only pictures we were seeing in that moment were social media pictures. And certainly I think we can all agree that social media was a driver of those events. I asked the congressman, where did we go from here in terms of free speech and protecting the First Amendment? And obviously this is something you've given a lot of thought about.
Yeah, it's actually something that I've been looking at globally for many years. For 6 years, I was the UN Special Rapporteur, which is sort of the principal monitor for free speech issues worldwide. And I think it's interesting to start the conversation in a way by noting that social media has this intense influence, not only in the United States. I mean, in fact, in the United States, because we have so many different avenues to get information, it's even less important in some ways than it is in other parts of the world where Facebook is the internet. And not only is Facebook the internet, it's also the public square, it's the media, it's everything. So when we think about it in those terms, whether we're talking about the United States or overseas, I think we need to be thinking in terms of what rules do we want to apply in this space and who's responsible for making those rules. And I guess the place that I start in thinking about these issues is the fact that social media and search and other internet companies are extremely opaque. Right? We have very little insight into how they make their rules, how they enforce those rules, how they decide what the algorithms should be that determine what information is seen and what isn't. And we have to crack that open in a way. And I think the first step for thinking about regulation of this space, that is government intervention, is to think about tools of making it more open to people to investigate, sort of open up the hood and get inside and actually see what's happening, because there's a lot of suggestion out there about government coming in and actually deciding what's okay and what's not online. And that leads to a very, I hate to say slippery slope, but it definitely leads down a path towards government engagement in our speech, which I think we want to try to avoid.
Well, and you bring up a really good point, and something that the congressman and I talked about is that as we, look at more and more polls about how people look at the First Amendment and free speech in particular, that more and more young people in particular are saying, yeah, free speech is not that important, that maybe that should be curtailed. So, I mean, talk about a slippery slope. There's the first danger there. And I think for all of us who have watched maybe The Social Dilemma, where you touched on algorithms, that the algorithms were not only driving whether or not we shopped at a particular store or picked up a certain brand of ice cream, but they were also branding us into a corner of like thinking, whether it was social or political, and then really compounding that over and over and over again. But we have no idea how they're doing what they're doing to put us into those corners.
Right. And unless and until we actually know how they're doing what they're doing and what it is they're actually doing in order to mediate speech, I think we're in a very difficult position to say it should be regulated in this way or that way. And so that's why I think opening it up to public scrutiny and public oversight is so important as a first step. But I also think you're right that there's a moment that we're in right now where the decision about what companies allow, like their rules around what speech is permitted and is not permitted, is being conflated right into a question of what government can allow and not allow. And those are very different things. And I think we need to really have a debate that separates those things out. So on the one hand, government under the First Amendment and under international human rights law, so this is sometimes lost in American discussions, these are universal norms. So we don't want to be in a position where government is making decisions about what speech is okay and what's not okay. I mean, once we go down that path, we're in the path of essentially similar to authoritarian governments around the world, putting pressure on companies, criminalizing individuals for criticizing government, for reporting issues, for example, reporting on terrorism and then saying that's terrorism itself. So there's a lot of restriction on speech around the world, and we need to be careful not to provide any future government in the United States the tools to do that as well. On the other hand, we do, I think, and we see this in the public debate, believe that social media companies have so much power today that there needs to be some kind of constraint on them in terms of what rules they're adopting. And I think that leads to two potential issues. I mean, one is, how do we do that? Like, what does a constraint look like? And there's some creative ideas out there around how you create some public oversight and, almost civil society oversight around the platforms, which could be really helpful in allowing people to have a rigorous debate. But the other is, as young people are trying to understand, well, what does free speech actually mean? We should be clear about the difference between what a private actor like a social media company can do and should do versus what the government can and should do.
So you bring up a really interesting point, and I 100% agree with you. We do not want to move into an authoritarian Big Brother oversight role, in terms of looking at social media companies. But in a way, can government then look at, well, the businesses, the companies shouldn't be doing that either. If they are really just content, they're not content curators, they're just really providing the platform. Should there be, are you saying that there should be regulation of those algorithms, that they shouldn't be just they're basically moderating speech by not letting everything come at you. They're just saying, oh, we just want you to see this small segment of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. So I think that we're at a moment where there should be regulation, but what that regulation is that's what's at issue. And so for me, the way I think about it is regulation should, in the first instance, be focused on transparency. You know, access to information so that people have an understanding of what the algorithm is, what the rules are. But it also, I think, there's room for us to be thinking about other tools. For example, one of the ways in which companies have really gathered so much power in this space is their business model. So what you're suggesting is right. They're conducting this tracking, this gathering of individual data that feeds into their algorithms. It also makes them a lot of money. These companies are like ATM machines for their investors. And so what we need to be thinking about is how do we basically attack the business model, right? How do we open that up to scrutiny? How do we focus on consumer protection? So just to give one example, because misinformation is a big issue today, particularly around COVID and the pandemic. A lot of the misinformation and disinformation that is circulating online is connected to hucksters, fraudsters, people who are trying to make a buck, who are trying to sell you on some, like new approach to dealing with COVID. And so they also say, well, the vaccines aren't going to work, but look at our product, it works. That's not just about speech. That's about fraud. And, American law for, decades has
we
protected
have laws
consumers.
on the books for that. Yeah.
Exactly. And so those are the kinds of tools that we could be thinking about to address things like disinformation. Now, that doesn't help for things like hate speech and other forms of speech online that are problematic, for democratic institutions. But it's a good place for us to be starting, at least, this conversation.
Well, can an argument be made that we already do have the laws we need? Maybe we're just not enforcing them correctly. So I think it's great that you bring up the the analogy to the snake oil salesman. There's not much difference between what you see in your news feed and whatever social platform you are, and then an 1800s newspaper that is like, oh look, cocaine, it's the new great medicine of our time. You should use this, and other kinds of weird forms. And yelling fire in a crowded theater is still not protected speech, and it doesn't matter what platform you use or what the megaphone is. We still have rules about that.
It's true. I mean, I've used this example. I like that you used the idea of a pamphlet in the 19th century. I've often used with people the idea on the hate speech side. And this is something that I think people in Orange County know the history of, right? Not very long ago, the John Birch Society could be out there, circulating pamphlets that were deeply racist, anti-Semitic, anti all sorts of, people of color. I mean, you name it, terrible stuff. And yet, the ACLU, as an example, would defend their right to do that. Right. And why would they? I mean, in part, it's because, the connection between that pamphleting and the audience was probably pretty close, and you didn't have the reach that we have with online speech. Now, if we think about John Birch Society material today and putting that online, suddenly we're in a different zone where that material, which, back in the day may not have incited violence, but it certainly incited hostility and discrimination. Today that, online can circulate so quickly and so broadly that it takes on a kind of a role in inciting violence against, historically marginalized communities and others. And so, that allows us to think about the difference between the old pamphleting and the way we think about online speech. And I think, again, we can go back to thinking about what opens up the platforms to regulation, to transparency. What are the tools that we could use, and even that companies could be required to implement around things like slowing down the, the spread of information that's inciting violence and so forth. And
Right.
I think there are things that can be done. And the last thing I would say is, as a part of the transparency and as a part of the regulation, one thing that government could do is say to companies, if you're introducing new products, if you are creating new rules or adopting new rules, you need to do a kind of what I think of as a human rights impact assessment before you launch it, right? So what will the impact of this rule be on the human rights of individuals, whether they're users or they're not users? What would be the impact on democratic processes and institutions? The companies don't really do that assessment before. They just sort of adopt a rule and put it out into the wild. There are a
Right.
lot of things that can slow down those processes and inject a kind of, I would say, free speech, but also human rights sensitive approach to the problems that we're talking about.
Well, and I come back to your analogy with the pamphlet. So when the pamphlets were passed out, it wasn't the only thing you saw in the world. So now the algorithms are manipulating it so that when someone passes out hateful information or erroneous information due to an algorithm, it may be the only thing you see. There is nothing else around it to give it context, to fight it, to even just question it. Is that the more dangerous aspect of what we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point that you're making. I think one of the problems, it's not just an algorithmic problem, it's also a problem. I'm sure everybody who, is listening to this conversation experiences this. We have this flood of information right now. We're living in this society and in this era where there's just so much information that is pushed at us so regularly. And to the extent that there's a lot of disinformation out there, particularly, let's say, information that either has a harmful public health role or is hateful or something like that, there's so much of that, it is indeed crowding out other information. So we're not in a zone where, we could think of a marketplace of ideas, right? Where we have, people able to, gather information that, well, they've learned something new, but then here's the argument against it. It's very hard to find that argument against it these days. So there's really an important role for companies to adopt, to think about, well, what is it that they should be doing in order to ensure that there is space for people to get multiple sources of information.
And let's just leave on this, because this is an age-old question in terms of that we've been dealing with as an open society. When we talk about social media and the individual, we're looking at policy, we're talking about algorithms. What is the individual's personal responsibility? Does that play into this as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's also a really great question. I mean, of course, we want our public space to be robust. We want people to be creative, inventive. We shouldn't shy away from offensive speech or satire. Part of that is integral to having an open society. But, individuals, and some of this is about training, frankly, individuals should think twice sometimes about sharing information. I mean, I know that I might in the past have seen something related to COVID, for example, and it seems terrible. So I want my friends to see that, or I want an audience to see that, so I retweet it. Well, I think, and actually the companies are thinking about this, right? Because they put on some brakes on what you can share. They've sort of said, you might have seen this on Twitter. You read an article, or you don't read the article, but the headline seems shocking, so you go to retweet it. And then, a little box pops up that says, you haven't read this, are you sure you want to share it? That's a part of that. I mean, it's a little Big Brother-ish, right? A little patronizing.
But it still cautions you.
There's a caution. There's a caution, and we need to find the balance between, individuals exercising a bit of caution versus individuals being told they can and cannot share things.
In terms of everything that you were just talking about, in terms of some of the tools and the rules, in terms of personal responsibility and the First Amendment, we're seeing more of people taking things into their own hands in terms of cancel culture, and that's become a hot buzzword and a hot topic. Does that lead us in a direction that's dangerous? Is it a natural outgrowth? How do you view that trend?
Yeah, I mean, on cancel culture, I'm often perplexed because people have different ideas as to what cancel culture actually means. Does it mean social pressure around certain ideas and expression? Does it mean, employers who are overly sensitive to controversy and so are firing people or, reassigning them because of pressure they're getting from the public? I mean, my view is that generally speaking, there's the thing that we're calling cancel culture is actually a robust expression of views and ideas, and people who have maybe typically not been a part of public conversations are now a part of those conversations. And so, for example, there was this instance must have been last summer, when Senator Tom Cotton wrote this op-ed in the New York Times, right? And in this op-ed, it was shortly after, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protests, and essentially he said, at a certain point, the military needs to be called out to deal with this, which was shocking and also for many people a form of incitement. And so people asked, how did the New York Times let this happen? And cancel culture, as it were, eventually led to the op-ed, the opinion editor of the New York Times being fired, losing his job for allowing this op-ed to take place. And on the one hand, you might think, well, that's a cancellation, right? I mean, doesn't Senator Cotton have the ability to make that argument? Well, sure he does. I mean, he's got a million platforms to do it. The New York Times doesn't need to give him that platform. And so the question then is, well, was the response, firing the editor, a kind of overreaction that interferes with the overall kind of robustness of our debate? I tend not to see it as that big of a problem. I mean, on the other hand, I mean, there are taboos in our society. Right. And I don't think we should shy away from discussing those taboos. It doesn't mean, using particular words in a way that's gratuitous, or it also doesn't mean thinking about your audience when you're speaking, what might, deeply offend. And that goes to your question about what's the responsibility of individuals. But we still don't want government intervening in those decisions. Social pressures will always be there, and right. Social norms will always change. As long as we keep a pretty firm distinction between those kinds of pressures, the pressures of the market, from government regulation, I think people can be concerned about it, but I'm not as concerned as when it's the government saying what you can and cannot speak.
Well, thank you for that. And I think clearly this is going to be a discussion that goes on for a while. We're already seeing, for example, in Cuba, where the first thing the government cut off was the internet. Just showing its power and to not only communicate, but to connect and share information. So any last thoughts that you'd like to share in terms of, for example, Congressman Correa is saying, he's going right back. He's going to be on Homeland Security. He's working on cybersecurity, and he's working on the judiciary. And they're going to be looking at all of this and start framing up that policy. What is your one wish as they go into those rooms and start banging this out? What would you want to remind them of?
Yeah, thank you for asking me that and giving me this chance to say this. I mean, I think, the American conversation in Congress has been largely unprofessional and unproductive. And you can compare it to the conversation that's taking place in Europe right now. So the European Union is considering regulation around online information. And their debate is pretty well rooted in fundamental human rights standards, in public policy. It's professional. The American conversation is extraordinarily politicized. And I think that, my hope is that, the Democratic leadership in Congress will move the conversation, to this first level, which I think is super important, which is let's get the information that we need in order to make public policy choices. And that means let's regulate the companies, but let's regulate their transparency. Let's regulate what we know about them so that over the next couple of years, we can make better decisions with better information about what this space should look like, because the stakes are really high. As all of your questions have really headed towards, the stakes are about the future of free speech, the future of how generations, coming into public space understand free speech. So these are really important issues, and I just hope Congress tries to move away from the politicization and into the space of these are the things we really need to know in order to make good decisions.
Well, Professor, thank you for that. And thank you for joining us today. I really think that you've added a lot to our conversation, and I'm really glad we had a chance to talk today.
Great. Thanks, Ariana. And hopefully next time, numbers will be lower. We'll do this in person. But I really appreciate the opportunity.
Expect an invitation back. You have a lot to share with us.
Thanks so much.
For those of you who are joining us, thank you so much for being part of our conversation today. As always, you can watch this interview, both interviews again online at www.ocforum.org. And thanks for stopping by.